It began as a whirlwind romance, the kind that seemed almost too good to be true. For George and Alexis, life had unfolded like a perfect dream, a chance encounter, an instant connection, and the kind of deep, soulful bond that many people spend their entire lives searching for. George, a 30-year-old software engineer with a sharp mind and a calm demeanor, had been working tirelessly on his career for years. Love had always seemed elusive to him, a concept more suited to fairy tales and movies than to his own reality. That was until Alexis appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. Alexis was unlike anyone George had ever met. She was beautiful, confident, and intelligent, with a wit that left him in awe. From the moment they met, he was enchanted by her, a tall, graceful woman with long, flowing, dark hair and bright, expressive eyes. They shared interests, a similar sense of humor, and a love for adventure that had them traveling together almost as soon as they started dating. Their connection felt effortless, and within 6 months, George was on one knee, proposing to Alexis on a mountaintop during one of their hiking trips. She said yes, her smile radiating warmth as she accepted the ring. Their wedding, a modest but elegant affair, followed soon after, attended by close family and friends. It was everything George could have hoped for. The vows, the first dance, the promises of a lifetime spent together. He was blissfully in love, content in the belief that he had found the one person he could truly share his life with. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect relationship, there was a secret, one that Alexis had kept hidden from George for as long as they had known each other, a secret that, once revealed, would shatter everything. The first few weeks of their marriage were blissful. George and Alexis had moved into a charming suburban home just outside of the city. It was small but cozy, with enough space for the two of them to start a family someday. George loved coming home from work to find Alexis in the kitchen, preparing dinner, her soft laughter filling the air as they talked about their day. They spent their evenings curled up on the couch, watching movies or discussing their future. George couldn't imagine being happier, but as time went on, George began to notice subtle changes in Alexis's behavior. She seemed more distant at times, as though something was weighing heavily on her mind. There were moments when she would retreat into herself, her laughter fading, her gaze turning somber. When George asked her what was wrong, she would always brush it off, assuring him that everything was fine, but her reassurances did little to ease his growing concern. George loved Alexis with all his heart, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was keeping something from him. He tried to push the thoughts aside, telling himself that every marriage had its ups and downs. After all, they had only been married for a few months. They were still adjusting to life together, still learning how to navigate the complexities of sharing a home and building a future. But the nagging sense that something wasn't right lingered in the back of his mind. It was a rainy afternoon when George's world came crashing down. He had come home from work early, hoping to surprise Alexis with flowers in a romantic evening. As he walked through the front door, he noticed the house was unusually quiet. He called out her name but received no response. Assuming she was out running errands, he made his way upstairs to their bedroom. As he entered the room, he spotted Alexis's laptop sitting open on the bed. A wave of curiosity washed over him. Alexis had always been very private about her personal devices, never leaving them unlocked or unattended. George hesitated for a moment, then sat down on the bed and glanced at the screen. What he saw made his heart stop. There on the screen was an email conversation between Alexis and a close friend of hers, one that George had never met. The messages were long and deeply personal, filled with words that George had never heard from Alexis before. And then, there it was, the secret that would change everything. In one of the messages, Alexis had confided in her friend about her past. She had been born male and had transitioned years before meeting George. The conversation detailed her fears about George finding out and how she had planned to tell him eventually, but the right moment had never come. George stared at the screen, his mind reeling. He couldn't believe what he was reading. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him, leaving him suspended in a state of shock. How could this be possible? How could Alexis have kept something so important from him? He felt a wave of anger rising within him, anger at the deception, anger at the lies. But beneath the anger, there was also a deep sense of betrayal. George had always prided himself on being open-minded and accepting, but this was different. This was personal. This was his wife, the woman he had vowed to spend the rest of his life with, and she had been hiding something so fundamental about herself. George felt as though his entire marriage had been built on a lie. That evening, when Alexis returned home, George was waiting for her in the living room. His mind was racing, his emotions a volatile mix of confusion, hurt, and anger. He hadn't said a word to her since she walked through the door, but the tension in the air was palpable. Alexis immediately sensed that something was wrong. She set down her bag and approached him cautiously. "George, is everything okay?" George didn't answer at first. He stood up from the couch, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained. "I know." Alexis's face went pale. What do you mean?" "I know everything," George said, his voice rising. "I saw the emails, Alexis. I know about your past. Why didn't you tell me?" Alexis's eyes filled with tears as she realized what had happened. She tried to reach out to him, but George recoiled, his anger boiling over. "How could you lie to me like this?" he shouted. "How could you keep something like this from me? I thought I knew you." "I wanted to tell you," Alexis said, her voice trembling. "I just didn't know how. I was scared, George. I was scared you wouldn't love me if you knew the truth." George shook his head, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "How could you marry me without telling me? How could you let me fall in love with you, knowing that you were keeping this from me?" Tears streamed down Alexis's face. "I didn't want to hurt you. I love you, George. I love you more than anything." But George couldn't hear her. All he could think about was the betrayal, the deception that had been at the heart of their relationship. He stormed out of the house, leaving Alexis standing alone in the living room, her heart breaking as she watched him walk away. In the days that followed, George didn't return home. He couldn't bear to face Alexis, couldn't bear the thought of looking her in the eyes after what he had discovered. He stayed with a friend, drowning his sorrows in alcohol and sleepless nights. His mind was consumed by the revelation, by the questions that plagued him at every turn. Had their entire relationship been a lie? Did Alexis ever truly love him? Or had she only been using him to hide her secret? George's thoughts spiraled into a dark place, the lines between love and hate blurring in his mind. Meanwhile, Alexis was left alone in their home, devastated by the fallout of their confrontation. She had always known that there was a risk in not telling George sooner, but she had never imagined it would end like this. She loved him deeply, but now it seemed as though that love had been twisted into something unrecognizable. Alexis tried reaching out to George, calling and texting him in the hopes that they could talk things through, but each time her messages went unanswered. She knew that George needed time, but she feared that he might never come back. It was a week later when George finally returned home. He was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from days of drinking and sleeplessness. He had spent the past few days wrestling with his emotions, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But as he walked through the front door, he realized that there were no easy answers. Alexis was sitting at the kitchen table when he entered, her face pale and drawn. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "George," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." George stood in the doorway, his hands trembling at his sides. He wanted to scream, to shout, to make her understand the depth of his pain, but all he could do was stare at her, the woman he had once loved so completely, and feel the weight of the betrayal between them. "I don't know if I can forgive you," George said finally, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way." Alexis's heart shattered at his words, but she knew that he had every right to feel the way he did. She had lied to him, kept a part of herself hidden for fear of losing him. But in the end, her silence had caused the very thing she had been trying to avoid. "Please," Alexis begged, her voice trembling. "Please, just give me a chance to make this right. I love you, George. I've always loved you." George's face hardened. "I don't even know who you are anymore." And with that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Alexis alone once again. As the days turned into weeks, the distance between George and Alexis only grew. George had moved out of their home, refusing to speak to Alexis or respond to her messages. He was consumed by his anger and hurt, unable to see a way forward from the betrayal he had experienced. Alexis, on the other hand, was devastated by the loss of her marriage. She had always known that telling George about her past would be difficult, but she had never imagined it would end like this. She had loved him with all her heart. But now that love seemed to have been poisoned by the lies and secrets she had kept. It was late one night when George finally returned back, but he was heavily drunk and started a heated argument with Alexis. In the heat of the moment, as their argument reached a fever pitch, George lost control. His hands, trembling with rage, reached for Alexis, grabbing her in a moment of blind fury. He didn't mean to hurt her, didn't mean for things to go as far as they did, but before he knew it, Alexis was on the floor, her body motionless. The room fell into an eerie silence. The only sound was George's ragged breathing as he stood over her, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. He knelt beside Alexis, shaking her, calling out her name, but she didn't respond. Panic set in as he realized what he had done. "Oh God," George whispered, his voice barely audible. "What have I done?" In a state of shock, George stumbled out of the house, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do. His thoughts were a chaotic jumble of fear, guilt, and disbelief. He hadn't meant for this to happen. He hadn't meant to hurt her. He ran, fleeing from the scene of the crime, hoping that somehow he could escape the reality of what he had done. Alexis's body was discovered later that evening after a concerned neighbor heard the commotion and called the police. The investigators arrived at the scene, finding Alexis lifeless on the floor of the couple's home. There were signs of a struggle, but no immediate clues as to who was responsible. George was nowhere to be found. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that George was the prime suspect. The police discovered the emails on Alexis's laptop, revealing the secret she had kept from her husband. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place, the heated argument, George's sudden disappearance, and the tragic outcome. For days, George was on the run, hiding from the authorities as he grappled with the enormity of what he had done. But the guilt was too much to bear. He knew that he couldn't run forever. Eventually, George turned himself in, walking into a police station with his head hung low, ready to face the consequences of his actions. The trial was a media spectacle. Drawing attention from across the country, the story of a newlywed husband discovering his wife's transgender identity and the resulting tragedy captivated the public's imagination. Both George and Alexis's families were thrust into the spotlight, their private pain laid bare for the world to see. George's defense team argued that he had acted in the heat of the moment, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't control. They painted a picture of a man who had been deceived, whose world had been turned upside down by a secret that shattered the foundation of his marriage. But the prosecution argued that George's actions were inexcusable, that no amount of emotional turmoil could justify the taking of another person's life. They presented evidence of the physical altercation, highlighting the fact that George had left Alexis to die, fleeing the scene rather than seeking help. The trial was long and grueling, with both sides presenting emotional testimony. George's family spoke of the loving, kind man they had known, struggling to reconcile that image with the man who had killed his wife. Alexis's family, devastated by her death, spoke of the pain and loss they felt, their daughter's life cut tragically short by a man who had claimed to love her. In the end, George was found guilty of manslaughter. The jury convinced that while he hadn't intended to kill Alexis, his actions had been reckless and violent. He was sentenced to several years in prison, a punishment that felt both too little and too much for a man who had acted out of a momentary lapse in control. The aftermath of the trial left both families shattered. Derek's family struggled to come to terms with what he had done. His parents, who had always seen him as a kind and gentle soul, were devastated by the reality that their son was responsible for the death of his wife. They visited him in prison, but their conversations were strained, the weight of what had happened hanging heavy between them. Alexis's family, on the other hand, was consumed by grief. They had lost their daughter in the most horrific way imaginable, and no amount of justice could ever bring her back. They struggled with feelings of anger and sadness, their hearts broken by the loss of a woman who had overcome so much in her life, only to be taken away so suddenly. In the wake of the tragedy, both families were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The media moved on to the next big story, but for those left behind, the pain remained. George, now behind bars, spent his days reflecting on the choices he had made, the life he had destroyed in a single tragic moment of rage. The story of George and Alexis is one of love, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of secrets kept for too long. It serves as a reminder of the fragility of relationships, of how quickly love can turn to anger, and how the choices we make in moments of intense emotion can have far-reaching consequences. For George, the cost of his actions was immeasurable. He lost his wife, his freedom, and the life he had envisioned for himself. But more than that, he lost a part of himself, the man he had once been, replaced by the man who had taken another person's life in a moment of blind fury. For Alexis, the cost was even greater. She had lived her life with courage, embracing her true self despite the challenges she had faced. But in the end, it was the love she had for George, the fear of losing him, that led to her tragic end. In the aftermath of the tragedy, both families were left to grapple with their pain, their loss, and the difficult question of how things could have been different if only the truth had been told sooner. For those who knew George and Alexis, their story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of secrets, the importance of honesty, and the devastating power of anger. As the years rolled by, the sharp edges of the tragedy dulled slightly, but the scars remained for those involved. George, now serving time for manslaughter, spent his days reflecting on the life that could have been. His once bright future had been forever altered by a single moment of uncontrolled rage. He tried to find meaning in his days behind bars, but there was no escaping the weight of his guilt. In prison, George enrolled in counseling, trying to understand the emotions that had driven him to such a devastating act. It was in these sessions that he began to confront his own insecurities, his fears, and the toxic masculinity that had played a part in his inability to handle Alexis's secret. He spoke openly of his love for her and the profound loss he felt, but there was always the unspoken knowledge that none of it could change what he had done. Alexis's family, though irreparably broken by her loss, found solace in honoring her memory. They established a foundation in her name to support LGBTQ+ individuals, offering education and resources to help foster understanding and acceptance. They hoped that in sharing Alexis's story, others might be spared the kind of heartbreak and violence that had claimed her life. George's family also wrestled with their grief. They visited him regularly, and while their conversations were often painful, they stood by him, trying to reconcile the son they had raised with a man who had committed such a terrible act. They, too, struggled to make sense of the tragedy, clinging to the hope that George's eventual release would offer some semblance of redemption. The media had long moved on, but the echoes of George and Alexis's story remained a powerful reminder of the complexities of identity, love, and acceptance. The lessons of their short-lived marriage became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the importance of honesty, communication, and empathy in relationships. The story ended with a reflection on the broader issues that their story illuminated. How secrets, even those rooted in fear, can tear apart the very foundations of love. Experts weighed in, discussing the importance of education and understanding, urging society to foster environments where people can feel safe to live authentically without fear of judgment or rejection. If I had known then what I know now, things would have been different. I would have loved Alexis for who she truly was, but now it's too late. Said by George in prison in broken voice. The lesson was clear. Love can only thrive where honesty lives, and the cost of secrets can be more than anyone is willing to pay. As the years passed, the memory of George and Alexis's love story faded into the background, a distant memory of a tragedy that had captivated the public's attention for a brief moment in time. But for those left behind, the pain of that day remained, a wound that would never fully heal. This has been another episode of Shadowed Secrets, where we explore the darkest corners of the human mind and the crimes that shock the world. Remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all our latest episodes. Until next time, stay safe and keep your loved ones close. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.